was Saturday noon, and Solomon had just returned from his usual morning sojourn up street. He had taken off his coat and was washing his face at the sink while his wife was dishing up the midday meal. There was salt codfish, soaked fresh and stewed in milk, picked up, as the phrase goes. There were baked potatoes and a thin, pale-looking pie. Mrs. Peaslee did not believe in pampering the flesh, and she did believe in saving every possible cent. "Well," said Mr. Peaslee, as they sat down to this feast, "I guess I've got news for ye." His wife gazed at him with interest. "Are you drawed?" she asked. "Got the notice from Wickham right in my pocket. Grand juror. September term. 'Tain't more'n a week off." The staccato utterance was caused by the big mouthfuls of codfish and potato which, between phrases, Mr. Peaslee conveyed to his mouth. It was plain to see that he was greatly pleased with his new dignity. "What do they give you for it?" asked his wife. Solomon should accept no office which did not bring profit. $2 a day and mileage," said Mr. Peaslee, with the emphasis of one who knows he will make a sensation. "Mileage? What's that?" "Travelin' expenses. State allows you so much a mile. I get 8 cents for going to the courthouse." "You get 8 cents every day?" asked his wife, her eyes snapping. She was vague about the duties of a grand juror. Maybe he had to earn his $2, but she had exact ideas about the trouble of walking up street. To get 8 cents for that was being paid for doing nothing at all, and she was much astonished at the idea. "Likely now, ain't it?" said Mr. Peaslee, with masculine scorn. "State don't waste money that way. Mileage is to get you there and take you home again when term's over. You're supposed to stay round 'tween whiles." "Huh," said his wife, disappointed. "They give you $2 a day," she hazarded the shot, "just for settin' round and talkin', don't they? Walkin's considerable more of an effort for most folks." "Sittin' around and talkin'!" exclaimed Mr. Peaslee, so indignantly that he stopped eating for a moment, knife and fork upright in his rigid, scandalized hands, while he gazed at his thin, energetic, shrewish little wife. "Settin' round and talkin'! It's mighty important work, now I tell you. I guess there wouldn't be much law and order if it wa'n't for the grand jury. They don't take none but men of judgment. Takes gumption, I tell you. You have to pay money to get that kind." "Well," said his wife, with the air of one who concedes an unimportant point, "anyhow, it's good pay for a man whose time ain't worth anything." "Ain't worth anything!" exclaimed Mr. Peaslee in hurt tones. "Now, Sarepty, you know better than that. I don't know how they'll get along without me up to the bank. They've got a pretty good idea of my judgment about mortgages. They don't pass any without my say-so." Mrs. Peaslee sniffed. "I seen you in the bank window, sittin' round with Jim Bartlett and Si Spooner and the rest of 'em, readin' the paper. That's all I ever see you doin'. Must be wearin' on you." "Guess you never heard what was said, did you? Can't hear them thinkin', I guess. They're mighty shrewd up to the bank, mighty shrewd." They had finished their codfish and potato, and Mrs. Peaslee, without giving much attention to her husband's testimony to the business acumen of his banking friends, and incidentally of himself, pulled the pale, thin pie toward her and cut it. "Pass up your plate," said she. When his plate was again in place before him, Mr. Peaslee inserted the edge of his knife under the upper crust and raised it so that he could get a better view of its contents. He had his suspicions of that pie. What he saw confirmed them. Between the crusts was a thin, soft layer of some brown stuff, interspersed with spots of red. "Them's the currants we had for supper the night before last, and that's the dried apple sauce we had for supper last night," he announced accurately. "And you know how I like a proper pie."
"I ain't gonna waste good victuals," said his wife with decision.
There was silence for a moment. Solomon did not dare make any further protest.
"I suppose," his wife said, picking up again the thread of her thoughts, "you'll have to wear your go-to-meeting suit all the time to the grand jury. I expect they'll be all wore out at the end. That'll take off something. You be careful now. Sitting round's awful wearing on pants. You get a chair with a cushion. And don't you go treating cigars. And don't you go to the hotel for your victuals. I ain't going to have you spending your money when you could just as well come home. Where you going now?"
Mr. Peaslee was putting on his coat. "Well," he said, "I kinda thought I'd step over to Eddard's. I thought maybe he'd be interested."
"Going to brag, are you?" was his wife's remorseless comment. "Much good it'll do you, talking to that hatchet face. He ain't so pious as he looks, if all stories are true."
But Mr. Peaslee was already outside the door. She raised her voice shrilly.
"You be back now. Them chickens has got to be fed."
Mr. Peaslee sought a more sympathetic audience. Being drawn for the grand jury had greatly flattered his vanity, for it encouraged a secret ambition which he had long held to get into public life. Service on the grand jury might lead to his becoming selectman, perhaps justice of the peace, perhaps town representative from Elmington. Who knew what else? He looked down a pleasant vista of increasing office, at the end of which stood the state capitol. He could be senator, perhaps. And he began planning his behavior as juror, the dignified bearing, the well-matured utterances, the shrewd cross-questioning. At the end of his service, his neighbors would know him for a man of solid judgment, a safe man to be entrusted with weighty affairs. Mr. Peaslee was 53 years old. He had a comfortable figure, a clean-shaven, round face, and blue eyes much exaggerated for the spectator by the strong lenses of a pair of great spectacles. These, with his gray hair, gave him a benevolence of aspect which somewhat misrepresented him. As a matter of fact, although good-humored and not without a still surviving capacity for generous impulse, he was only less near than his wife. Childishly vain, he bore himself with an air of self-satisfaction not without its charm for humorous neighbors. They said that they guessed he thought himself some punkins. Some punkins most people admitted him to be, although how much of his money and how much of his shrewdness was really his wife's was a matter of debate among those who knew him best. At any rate, the Peasleys had made money. A few years before, they had sold their fat farm down-river advantageously, and had bought the dignified white house in Elmington in which they have just been seen eating a dinner which looks as if they were house-poor. That they were not. They had $30,000 in the local bank, partly invested in its stock. In Elmington, Mrs. Peaslee was less lonely, and through Mr. Peaslee was an unsuspected director in the bank, and a shrewd user of the chances for profitable investment which her husband's association with the bank crowd opened to her. As for Mr. Peaslee, he did not know that he himself was not the business head of the house, and his garden, his chickens, and his pleasant loafing in the bank window kept him contentedly occupied. For, in spite of her shrewish tongue, Mrs. Peaslee had tact enough to let her husband have the credit for her business acumen. "I ain't going to let on," she said to herself, "that he ain't just as good as the rest of 'em." She had her pride. As Mr. Peaslee stepped along the straight walk which divided his neat lawn and opened the neat gate in his neat white fence, he met Sam Barton, the broad-shouldered, good-humored giant who was constable of Elmington. Sam gave him a smiling, "How are you, Squire?" as he passed. "Guess he's heard," said Mr. Peaslee to himself, much pleased. Yet, as a matter of fact, the greeting was not different from that which Sam had given him daily for the past 3 years. Once on the sidewalk, Mr. Peaslee turned to the right toward the house of his neighbor, Mr. Edwards. Edwards was a younger man than Peaslee, perhaps 47. His business was speculating in lumber and cattle, and in the interest of this, he was constantly passing and repassing the Canadian border, which was not far from Elmington. In the intervals between his trips he was much at home. He was a stern, silent, secretive man, and simply because he was so close-mouthed, there was much guessing and gossip, not wholly kind, about his affairs. Mr. Peaslee found the front door of the Edwards house standing open in the trustful village fashion, and, with neighborly freedom, walked in without ringing. He turned first into the sitting-room, where he found no one, and then into a rear room opening from it. This obviously was a boy's den. On the table in the center were a checkerboard, some loose string, a handful of spruce gum, some scattered marbles, a broken jackknife, a cap, a shot pouch, an old bird's nest, a powder flask, a dog-eared copy of Caesar's Commentaries, open, and a Latin dictionary, also open. In a corner stood a fishing rod in its cotton case. Along the wall were ranged bait boxes, a fishing basket, a pair of rubber boots, and a huge wasp's nest. Leaning against the sill of the open window was a double-barreled shotgun, and on the sill itself were some black, greasy rags and a small bottle of oil. Various truths might be inferred from the disarray. One was that Mr. Edwards was generous to his son Jim, and another was that there was no Mrs. Edwards. Further, it might be easily enough guessed that Jim had been lured from the study of Latin, in which pretty Miss Ware, who was his teacher at the Union School, was trying to interest him, by the attractive idea of oiling his gun barrels, and that something still more attractive, perhaps a boy with crossed fingers, for it was not too late for swimming, had lured him from that. At any rate, Jim was not there. Mr. Peaslee, still bent on finding Mr. Edwards, moved toward the open window. But he could see no signs of life anywhere. None of the household was, however, far away. Jim was in the loft of the barn, where he was carefully examining a barrel of early apples with a view to filling his pockets with the best. The housekeeper had merely stepped across the street to borrow some yeast, and Mr. Edwards, who had a headache, was lying down in the chamber immediately above Jim's den. Mr. Peaslee stood and gazed. He eyed in turn the kitchen ell, the shed, and the barn, and then gazed out over the posy garden, where still bloomed a few late flowers, of which he recognized only the chiny asters. He looked toward what he himself would have called the sarce garden, with its cabbages, turnips, rustling corn stalks, and drying tomato vines. Seeing no one there, he set his gaze to the distant rows of apple trees, bright with ripening fruit. Disappointed, he was about to turn away, but he could not resist taking a complacent, sweeping view of his own adjoining possessions. There, on the right, ran the long line of his own dwelling, continued by the 5-foot board fence separating his garden from Mr. Edwards. This stood up gauntly white until near the orchard, where it was completely hidden by the high, feathery stalks of the asparagus bed, by a row of great sunflowers, now heavy and bent with their disc-like seed pods, and by a clump of lilac bushes. As his eye traveled along the white expanse, he gave a quick start, and his face clouded with vexation. There in the sun, prone upon the top of the fence, dozed the bane of his life, the Calico Cat. Her coat was made up of patches of yellow and white, varied with a black stocking on her right hind leg, and a large, round, black spot about her right eye, which gave her a peculiarly predatory and disreputable appearance. Solomon had disliked her at sight. Ever since he had bought the house in Elmington, he had been trying to drive her from the premises, but stay away she would not. Not all the missiles in existence could convince her that his house was not a desirable place of abode, and she was a constant vexation and annoyance. She jumped from the fence plump into the middle of newly planted flower beds. She filled the haymow with kittens. She asked all her friends to the barn, where she gave elaborate musical parties at hours more fashionably late than were tolerated in Elmington. Whenever she had indigestion, she ate off the tops of the choicest green things that grew in the garden, but when her appetite was good, she caught and devoured his young chickens. Moreover, when at bay, she frightened him. Once he had cornered the spitting creature in a stall. Claws out, tail big, fur all on end, she had leaped straight at his head, which he ducked, and landing squarely upon it, had steadied herself there for a moment with sharp, protruding claws. Thence she had jumped to a feed-box, thence to a beam, thence to the mow, from the dusky recesses of which she had glared at him with big, green, menacing eyes. Not since that experience, which, in spite of his soft hat, had left certain marks upon his scalp, had he ever attempted to catch her. Instead, he had borrowed a gun, and a dozen times had fired at her, but although he counted himself a fair shot, he had never made even a scant bit of fur fly from her disreputable back. And now he knew she laughed at him. Yes, laughed at him, for she had more than human intelligence. There was something demoniac in her cleverness, her immunity from harm, her prodigious energy, her malevolent mischief, her raillery. Actually, he had grown morbid about the beast. He had a superstitious feeling that in the end she would bring him bad luck. How he hated her! There she lay, with eyes shut, unsuspecting, comfortable, and basked in the warm September sunshine. Here at his hand was a double-barreled shotgun. The chance was too good. This vagrant, this outlaw, this trespasser, this thief. He catalogued her misdeeds in his mind as he clanged the ramrod down the barrels to see if the piece was loaded. It was not. But ammunition was at hand. He put in a generous charge from Jim's powder flask and rammed it home with a paper wad. He grabbed up the shot pouch and released the proper charge into his hand. He was disappointed. It was birdshot. Scattering as it would scatter, it could do that cat no harm. Nevertheless, he poured the pellets into the barrel. As he rammed home the paper wad on top of these, his eye caught the marbles lying on the table. He took one that fitted and rammed that home also, for luck. He placed a cap, lifted the gun to his shoulder, and fired. With a leap which sent her 6 feet into the air, the Calico Cat landed 4 square in Mr. Peasley's chicken yard, almost on the back of the dignified rooster, which fled with a startled squawk. She dodged like lightning across the chicken yard, between cackling and clattering hens, went up the wire netting walls, leaped to the roof, paused, considered, began to reflect that she had been shot at before and to wonder at her own fright, stopped, and sitting down on the ridgepole, looked inquiringly in Mr. Peasley's direction. She was, of course, entirely unharmed. But other matters were claiming Mr. Peasley's attention. Out from behind the screen formed by the asparagus plumes, the currant bushes, the sunflowers, and the lilacs, all of which grew not so far from the spot on the fence where the Calico Cat had been sitting, fell a man. Solomon had a mere glimpse. Standing behind taller bushes, the stranger had fallen behind lower ones, and only while his falling figure was describing the narrow segment of a circle had he been visible. But the glimpse was enough. Mr. Peasley's jaw dropped, his face turned white. But the next moment he gave a great sigh of relief. He saw the man rise and slip into cover of the bushes, and so disappear through the orchard. He had not then killed the fellow. Relieved of that fear, he thought of himself. What would people say were he charged with firing at a man? He, a respectable citizen, a director in the bank, a grand juror. They must not know. He silently laid the gun back against the window-sill, turned with infinite care, and tiptoed quickly back into the sitting-room, into the hall, into the street. Not a soul was visible. Nevertheless, such was Mr. Peasley's agitation, so strongly did he feel the need of silence, that, placing a shaking hand upon the fence to steady himself, he tiptoed along the sidewalk all the way to his own house. There the fear of his wife struck him. He was in no condition to meet that sharp-eyed, quick-tongued lady. He softly entered the front door and penetrated to the dark parlor, where, as no one would ever enter it except for a funeral or a wedding, he felt safe from intrusion. There he sank down upon the slippery horsehair lounge, and, staring helplessly at the severe portrait of Mrs. Peasley, done by a lugubrious artist in crayon, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and tried to collect his scattered faculties. "Whew!" he breathed. "Whew!" End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Calico Cat. Meanwhile, at the Edwards house, life had grown suddenly interesting. When the report of the gun reached Jim, he had stopped pawing over the apple barrel and was sitting on the upper step of the staircase at the extreme end of the loft, slowly munching an apple and thinking. Jim was a healthy, active boy, with no more sense than naturally belongs to a boy of 15, and with a lively imagination, which had been most unfortunately overstimulated. Without a mother, and with a father who paid him scant attention, he read whatever he liked, and as a result, his head was full of romantic road agents delightfully kind to little crippled daughters at home, fierce pirates who supported aged and respectable mothers, and considerate bandits who restored valuable watches when told they were prized on account of tender associations. His imagination had been still further fed by certain local legends and happenings, highly colored enough to excite the keenest interest. Elmington is, as has been said, near the Canadian border. The place abounds in tales of smuggling, and the popular gossip, as gossip everywhere has a pleasing way of doing, associates the names of the most respectable and unlikely people with the disreputable ventures of the smugglers. Of course, a story of contraband trade is the more striking if the narrator can hint that the judge of probate or the most stern of village deacons might tell a good deal if he were disposed, and there are always persons ready to give this sort of interest to their yarns. In Ilmington lived Jake Farnham, an ex-deputy marshal and an incorrigible liar, about whom gathered the boys, Jim among them, to hear exciting stories of chase and detection, exactly as boys in a seaport town gather about an old sailor to hear tales of pirates and buccaneers. And Jake loved to hint darkly that the best people shared in the illicit traffic. With it all, Jim's sense of right and wrong was in a fair way to become hopelessly mixed. Exactly as boys at the seashore are prone to believe that a pirate is, on the whole, an admirable character, so these border boys, and especially Jim, had come to feel, only with more excuse because of the generally indulgent view of the community, that smuggling is an occupation in which anyone may engage with credit, and which is much more interesting than most. Now, it is not likely that Jim's father, a stern, secretive, obviously prosperous man, with an intermittent business which took him back and forth across the border, could in all this gossip escape a touch of suspicion. No one, of course, denied that he really did deal in lumber and cattle. The fact was obvious. But there were hints and whispers, shrewd shakings of the head, and more than one guessed that all Edward's profits didn't come from cattle, no, nor lumber, neither. Latterly these whispers had become more definite. Pete Lemery, a French-Canadian, whom Mr. Edwards had hired as a drover and abruptly discharged, was spreading stories about his former employer which made Blackbeard the pirate seem like a babe by comparison. Pete was not a very credible witness, but still, building upon a suspicion that already existed, he succeeded in adding something to its substantiality. These stories had come to Jim's ears, and Jim was delighted. The consideration that, were the stories true, his father was a criminal did not occur to him at all. Like the foolish romantic boy he was simply pleased to think of his father as a man of iron determination, cool wit, unshakable courage, whom no deputy sheriff could overmatch, and who was leading a life full of excitement and danger, the smuggler king. The only thing that Jim regretted was that his father did not let him share in these exploits. He knew he could be useful, but his father's manner was habitually so forbidding that Jim did not dare hint a knowledge of these probable undertakings, much less any desire to share them. Poor Mr. Edwards! He loved his boy, but did not in the least know how to show it. Silent, with a sternness of demeanor which he was unable wholly to lay aside even in his friendliest moments, much away from home, and unable to meet the boy on his own level when he was there, deprived of the wife who might have been his interpreter, he had no way of becoming acquainted with his son. Anxious in some way to share in Jim's life, he took the clumsy and mistaken method of letting him have too much pocket money. Yet if Jim, thus unguided and overindulged, had gone astray in his conduct, Mr. Edwards was not the man to know his mistake and take the blame. He had in him a rigidity of moral judgment, a dryness of mind which made it certain that if Jim did do what he disapproved, he would visit upon him a punishment at once severe and unsympathetic. The man's air of cold strength excited in the son fear as well as admiration. His reserve kept his naturally affectionate boy at more than arm's length. Poor Mr. Edwards! Poor Jim! misunderstanding between them was as sure to occur as the rise of tomorrow's sun. Pat on Jim's speculations about his father's stirring deeds, the gunshot came echoing through the silent barn. Jim ran to the loft door and looked out. He saw smoke curling up from the window of his den and knew that it was his own gun that had been fired. Back in the room, a vague masculine figure moved hastily out of the door. Jim looked toward the orchard and caught sight of another man disappearing in the trees. He was wild with excitement. As he knew that his father was the only person in the house, he was sure that his father had fired the shot. The tales that he had heard, his belief in his father's life of adventure, made him conclude that here was some smuggler's quarrel. So vividly did the notion take possession of his inflamed imagination that nothing henceforth could shake it. He simply knew what had happened. And his father had fled, leaving all the evidences of his shot behind him. Jim's loyal heart bounded. Here he could help. He turned, raced across the loft, clattered down the steep, cobwebby stairs, slipped through the shed passage, through the kitchen, and on into his own room. He knew what to do. Nothing must show that the gun had ever been used. He set feverishly to work. He swabbed out the weapon and hung it on its rack over the mantel. He tossed the rags into the fireplace and covered them with ashes. He put the shot pouch and the powder flask into their proper drawer. Then he pulled a chair to the table and set himself to a pretended study of Caesar. If anyone should come, it would look as if he had been quietly studying all the morning. All this had cost considerable self-denial, for of course he boiled with curiosity about the man in the orchard. He did not dare to go out there, but now, stealthily glancing out of the window, he saw his father returning from the garden with long strides. Jim understood. His father, going out at the front door, had slipped round to the side of the house so that it would look as if he had come from the street. He was not surprised that his father looked stern and angry. That fellow must have done something mighty mean, he thought, to make his father shoot, and he admired at once the magnanimity and the skill which had merely winged the man, as he supposed, by way, presumably, of teaching him a lesson. Then, struck by the boldness and openness of his father's return to the house, Jim suddenly felt that he had been foolish, that the cleaning of the gun had not been needed. What man would dare, after such a lesson, to complain against his father? Mr. Edwards walked straight into Jim's room. Aroused from his nap by the shot, he had leaped to the window and seen the man fall. He had then turned and run downstairs so quickly that he had not seen the fellow half rise and crawl into the bushes, and, having reached the spot, he was much relieved, if somewhat staggered, to find no body. He did find tracks, for this was plowed ground, but they told him nothing of the wounded man except that he had left in a hurry on a pair of rather large feet. He looked about for a while, and then started toward the house, determined to have an explanation with Jim. He knew Jim's gun by the sound of its report, and felt no doubt that the boy had fired the shot. What sort of culpable accident had happened? Suffering still with the splitting headache which he had been trying to sleep off, angry with Jim for his carelessness, concerned lest the man were really injured, Mr. Edwards was in his least compromising mood. "How did it happen?" he asked without preface. His tones were harsh, and he fixed Jim with stern eyes. "How did it happen?" repeated Jim in pure surprise. Certainly his father knew much better than he how it had happened. "Speak out," said Mr. Edwards impatiently. How did you come to shoot that man? I want to know about it."
"Me?" cried Jim in complete bewilderment. I haven't shot any man, Father. You know I haven't." Mr. Edwards, never a man of nice observation, and now bewildered with anger and headache, took his son's genuine astonishment for mere pretense and subterfuge. Were not the facts plain?
"I don't want any nonsense about this," he said incisively. "I heard your gun. I saw the man fall. No one else but you could possibly have fired it. It's useless to lie, and I won't stand it. Tell me at once what happened."
"I didn't shoot him, Father. You know I didn't," reiterated Jim, more and more dumbfounded. "I don't know how it happened, honest Injun. I don't, Father." Mr. Edwards' mouth shut tight. He swept the room with his eyes until they rested upon the gun in the rack over the mantelpiece. He stepped forward, took it down, and examined it. Holding it in his hands, he gazed about the floor. A rag which the ashes in the fireplace had not wholly covered caught his attention.
"You cleaned the gun and put it away," he said grimly. "Then you tried to hide the rag with which you cleaned it." And he touched the bit of cloth sticking from the ashes contemptuously with his foot. "What do you expect me to think from that?"
Jim was silent. The boy was unlike his father in many ways, but they were alike in this: they both were proud. Each would meet an unjust accusation in silence, and Jim was beginning to show another of his father's characteristics. A still anger was beginning to burn in him against this man who accused him of a deed which he himself had done, and he felt rising within him a stubborn will to endure, not to surrender. If his father was going to act like that, why, let him.
"Where is your shot pouch?"
asked Mr. Edwards. Jim motioned toward the drawer.
"Is your powder flask there, too?"
"Yes." Mr. Edwards was silent. After all, he was a just man. He was trying, as well as his headache would let him, to see things straight.
"It's plain what happened," he said at last. "You had an accident and got frightened. You cleaned your gun, you hid the rags, you put away your ammunition, you got your books and pretended to study. You're afraid to tell the truth now."
Jim's face flushed hotly, but he kept silent. Such assurance, such cruelty, he had never imagined. If this was what smugglers were like, if this was a sample of their tricks—
"I'll give you one more chance to tell the truth," said Mr. Edwards. "Did you do it?"
"No, I didn't," said Jim, and his jaw snapped closed like his father's.
"Very well," said Mr. Edwards. "I'll leave you until you change your mind. You will stay here. Sarah will bring you bread and milk at supper time. If you're willing to talk to me then, you may tell her that you'd like to see me."
He turned to go, then paused.
"It's a serious matter, and all the facts are against you. It would go hard with you in court. It will go harder if you stick to your stubborn and foolish lie. One thing more. If you don't choose to tell the truth, you will have to reckon with the law as well as with me."
Mr. Edwards, upon this, shut the door and departed. His was a stern figure, but the hurt within was very sore. This, then, he reflected bitterly, was the kind of boy he had. He suffered deeply at the discovery, which for him was unquestionable. Jim felt outraged. He had done his loyal best to save his father from the consequences of his rash act, and now, with incredible ingenuity and cool injustice, his father was using his son's acts of helpfulness to make it appear that he had done the deed.
Without a scruple, his father had made him a scapegoat. Jim told himself that he would gladly have taken the blame had his father, as chief of the band, demanded the sacrifice of this, his devoted follower. Nay, more, he would have endured the ordeal without a murmur had his father, deeming it unsafe to enter into formal explanations, only hinted to him that this was a farce which they two must play together. If his father had only winked at him! Surely he might have done that with safety. But not to be admitted to the secret, not to be allowed to play the heroic part, to be used as an ignoble tool by a father who neither loved him nor knew his courage, that was too much. He would not betray his father. No, 1,000 times no. But the day would come. The afternoon dragged on. Jim sat there in his room, looking out into the pleasant sunshine, conscious that the boys were playing three-old cat in the field not far away, as rebellious and magnanimous, as hot and angry, as heroic and morally muddled a boy as one could wish to see. And looking at the affair from his point of view, not many people will blame him. It is delightful, of course, to have a pirate chief for father, but what if he makes you walk the plank? It is amusing to think of Mr. Peaslee and Jim each shut up in his respective room, but of Mr. Peaslee in his gloomy parlor, faced by the crayon portrait of his masterful wife, a vase of wax flowers under a glass dome, the family Bible on a marble-topped table, and 3 stiff horsehair-covered chairs, had the advantage of being able to leave at any moment. He was even more perturbed in mind. "Terrible awkward mess," he kept repeating to himself as he mopped his damp forehead with his handkerchief. "Terrible awkward." And indeed it would be awkward for a respectable citizen with political aspirations to be accused before a grand jury of which he is a member of assault with a dangerous weapon upon an inoffensive man. Mr. Peaslee's reflections rose in a strophe of hope and fell in an antistrophe of despair. "'Tain't likely it hurt him any, just birdshot," said Hope. "Birdshot's mighty irritatin', 'specially to a wrathy fellow," said Despair. And alternating thus, his thoughts ran on. "Birdshot'll show I didn't have any serious intent, but maybe a piece of the marble struck him. He went off mighty lively. Don't seem as if he'd been hurt much. More scared hurt, likely. But he might have been hurt bad, arm or something, maybe. Marble. 'Tain't anything but baked clay, split all to pieces probably. But you can't tell. I've heard you can shoot a taller candle through an inch plank, and that's considerable softer than a marble. And that pesky cat's just as frisky as ever." Had anyone seen him? There certainly had not been anyone in the street, but where had been Mr. Edwards, Jim, the housekeeper? Where had his own wife been? There were windows from which she might have seen him returning, some from which she might even have seen him fire the fatal shot. But, pshaw, there now! Probably no one had seen him at all, not even his wife, not even his victim. Probably no one would ever find out. "Must have been some worthless fella, stealing apples maybe, who won't dare make a fuss. 'Tain't likely I'll ever hear anything of it. 'Tain't no use saying anything till something happens. What folks don't know don't hurt 'em none." The structure of comfort which he thus built himself was shaky indeed, but it had to serve. He nerved himself to meet his wife. He must not excite her suspicion by too long an absence. She was doubtless full of curiosity, for of course she had heard the shot, and would expect him to know what it meant. It would not do to seem to enter the house by the front door, sacred to formal occasions. So, sneaking outdoors again, he slipped round to the side of the house, and with much trepidation went into the kitchen. His wife began the moment she saw him. "Well, have all the crazy carryings on?" she cried. "What's the Edwards boy firing off guns for, right under peaceable folks' windows? I'm going to speak to Mr. Edwards right off."
"Now don't you, Sarepty, now don't you?"
said Mr. Peaslee in alarm. Relieved as he was to find himself unsuspected, he did not like the idea of having his wife pick a quarrel with Mr. Edwards for what he himself had done. The less said about that shot, the better he would be pleased. "For the land's sake, why not, I should like to know?"
"Well now, Sarepty, I wouldn't. That Edwards boy ain't more of a boy than most boys, I guess. Always seemed a real peaceable little feller. And Edwards is kind of touchy, I guess. It might make hard feelin'. 'Twouldn't look well for us to speak, bein' newcomers so. I wouldn't, Sarepty, I wouldn't. Maybe sometime I'll slide in a word, just slide it in kinder easy, if he does it again." And Mr. Peaslee looked appealingly at his wife through his big spectacles, his eyes looking very large and pathetic through the strong lenses. "Huh," said his wife, unmoved. "I ain't afraid of Edwards, if you be." Nor could she be moved from her determination. Mr. Peaslee was vastly disturbed. But presently he forgot this small annoyance in greater ones. That evening after tea, when he went up to the post office, he heard that Pete Lamoury had been shot by Jim Edwards, and was now in bed with his wounds. Jim's arrest was predicted. Young Farnsworth, who kept the crockery store, told him the news, and presently Jake Hibbard, the worst shyster in the village, shuffled in, noticeable anywhere for his suit of rusty black, his empty sleeve pinned to his coat, the green patch over his eye, and his tobacco-stained lips. He confirmed the report. "Pete's hurt bad," he said, shaking his head. "Hurt bad. I've taken his case. Young Edwards is going to see trouble." The speech frightened poor Mr. Peaslee, and he was hardly reassured by the skeptical smile of Squire Tucker, and his remark that he would believe that Lamoury was hurt when he saw him. The squire had small faith in either Lamoury or Hibbard. He knew them both. But Mr. Peaslee returned home with dragging feet. Silent and preoccupied all the evening, he went to bed early, but not to sleep. Long he lay awake and tossed, while the calico cat wailed on the rear fence, exultant, triumphant, insulting. And when he did finally get to sleep, he dreamed that he was being prosecuted in court by, was it Jake Hibbard with the green patch over his eye, or the calico cat with the black patch over hers? He could not tell, study the fantastic, ominous figure of his prosecutor as he would. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Calico Cat. Immediately after breakfast on Monday morning, Mr. Peaslee, in a mood of desperate self-sacrifice, started uptown to buy a knife for Jim. All day long on Sunday, when he had nothing to do but think, he had struggled between his fear of exposure and his sorrow for the boy. The upshot was a determination to make it up to him by giving him a knife. He had in his mind's eye a marvel, staghorn handle, 4 blades, saw, awl, file, hoof-hook, corkscrew. Such a knife as that, he felt, would console any boy for being arrested.
Most likely 'twill end up right there, he said to himself. I guess I'd better go to Farley's, he thought as he walked along. Farley owes money to the bank. He won't dare to stick it on like the rest. But when he entered the store and looked about, his face fell. Mr. Farley was not there. Willie Potter, Farley's clerk, a young man peculiarly distasteful to Solomon, lounged forward with a toothpick in his mouth. Mr. Peaslee had half a mind to go, but the thought of poor Jim held him back. "What will you have today, Mr. Peaslee?" inquired Willie affably. He winked at young Danny Snow, who sat grinning on a keg of nails, as much as to say, "Watch me have some fun with the old man." "I thought maybe I'd look at some jackknives," said Solomon, eyeing Willie distrustfully. "Yes, sir. I guess you want the best, regardless of expense," said Willie impudently. He well understood his customer's dislike for spending a penny. Stepping behind the counter, he drew from the showcase and held up admiringly the most costly knife in the store. "Here now, what do you say to this? Very superior article. Best horn, 10 blades. Best razor steel. $3.50, and cheap at the price. Can't be beat this side of Boston. Just the article for you, sir." And he winked again at Danny Snow, who was pink with suppressed merriment. Well now," said Solomon, taking the knife in his hand and pretending to examine it closely. "That's a pretty knife, to be sure. Real showy, ain't it? Looks as if it was made to sell, all outside and no money in the bank like some fellers you see." Danny Snow giggling outright, Mr. Peaslee turned and gazed at him in mild inquiry. Young Potter turned a dull red. He was addicted to radiant cravats and gauzy silk handkerchiefs, and from his salary of $8 a week he did not save much. But just the same, Mr. Peaslee had been staggered at the price. Pretending still to examine the knife which Willie had given him, he squinted past it at the contents of the glass showcase on which his elbows rested. There all sorts of knives confronted him, each in its little box, in which was stuck a card stating the price: $1.50, $1.25, 90 cents, 45 cents. The cheapest one would eat up the proceeds of 3 dozen eggs at 15 cents a dozen, a good price for eggs. He had forgotten that knives cost so much. "A good knife ain't any use to a boy," he reflected. "Break it in a day, lose it in a week. 'Twouldn't be any real kindness to him, just wasting money." He pointed finally to a stubby, wooden-handled knife with one big blade marked 25 cents. "There now," said he, "that's what I call a knife. Good and strong and no falderall. Guarantee the steel, don't you?" He opened the blade and drew it speculatively across his calloused old thumb, while with his mild blue eyes, which his spectacles enormously exaggerated, he fixed the humbled Willie. "That's a good knife for the money," said that young man. "Hand-forged." "Sho now, you don't say so," said Mr. Peaslee. "I guess you give a discount, don't you? Farley always allows me a little something." "You can have it for 21 cents, said Willie, much irritated. "Charge it?" "Guess I better pay cash," Mr. Peaslee answered hastily. If it were charged, his wife would question the item. Producing an enormous wallet, very worn and very flat, from his cavernous pocket, he deliberately searched until he found a Canadian 10-cent piece, and adding to it enough to make up the price, handed it to Potter and left the store. Mr. Peaslee, who remembered no gift from his father other than a very occasional big copper cent, thought himself pretty generous. Had he not spent pretty nearly the price of 24 eggs? But now a question occurred to him which he had not thought of before. How was he to get the knife to Jim? A gift from him would excite surprise, perhaps suspicion. It must not be known who had sent it. Ah, there was the post office. Going in, he pushed the little box through the barred window. "Say, Cyrus," he said to the postmaster, "kinder weigh up this consignment for me, will you?" The postmaster weighed the box. "That will cost you 6 cents, he said. "Thank you," returned Mr. Peaslee, and dropping the box into his deep pocket, departed. 6 eggs more to get it to his next-door neighbor. "'Tain't right," he muttered. "'Tain't right." Uncertain what to do with his gift, but feeling on the whole pretty virtuous, Mr. Peaslee now started home. He thought that Jim would not be going to school, but would wait at home for the threatened coming of the constable, but still he was not sure, and he wanted to keep the boy under his eye. Suddenly he straightened. There was Judge Ames walking up the street, valise in hand, just from the early morning train. He had come a few days before the opening of court. Mr. Peaslee knew him slightly, and stood much in awe of him. He was greatly pleased when the judge stopped and shook hands with him. "I am glad to hear, Mr. Peaslee," said the judge in his precise lawyer-like utterance, "that you are to be on the grand jury. We need men like you there." "Thank you, Judge, thank you," said Mr. Peaslee, overcome, and he walked on home, quite convinced that a person of his importance in the community should not be sacrificed to the comfort of any small boy. "And I've done right by the little feller, I've done right," he assured himself, feeling the knife. As he turned into his own yard, he cast an anxious eye over to the Edwards house. There sat Jim, elbows on knees, chin on hands, staring into space. Jim was thinking that his father, had he been a pirate chief, would not have wiped a filial tear from his eye whenever he thought of his mother, and the boy's face showed it. The spectacle greatly depressed Mr. Peaslee. The smallest, faintest question entered his mind whether a 25-cent knife would console such melancholy. To give himself a countenance while he watched events, Solomon got a rake and began gathering together the few autumn leaves which had fluttered down in its front yard. It was not useless labor, for they would come in handy later in banking up the house. And so, presently, he saw Sam Barton, the constable, his big shoulders rolling as he walked, advancing down the street. Mr. Peaslee expected him, nevertheless his appearance gave him a disagreeable shock. Suppose the constable had been coming for him? "Ain't arrestin' anybody down this way, be ye?" he called, with a feeble attempt at jocularity. Perhaps, after all— "Looks like it," said Barton succinctly. Mr. Peaslee stepped to the fence. "'Tain't likely they'll do much to a little feller like that, I guess," he said, searching the constable's face. "Dunno," said Barton, passing on. Solomon, much concerned, leaned on his rake and watched him enter the Edwards house. Jim had disappeared. There was some delay. Mrs. Peaslee came to the door. "Arrestin' that Edwards boy, be they, Solomon?" she said. "Well, serve him right, I say, shootin' guns off so. Like father, like son. I dunno as 'twas the son. I'd as soon believe it of the father. Everybody knows Lamoury and he's been mixed up together. Some of his smugglin' tricks, prob'ly." Mrs. Peaslee had taken a violent dislike to her taciturn neighbor, and she did not care who knew it. Her shrill voice seemed to her husband painfully loud, and indeed it was beginning to attract the attention of the group of children who had gathered about the Edwards gate. "Shh!" hissed Solomon. "Edwards might hear ye. 'Twould hurt us if he should take his account out of the bank." "Humph!" exclaimed Mrs. Peaslee. "Well," she added, "you go to the hearin'. Justice is something, I guess." But she said no more, and with her husband and the children awaited events, a silent group in the silent street before the silent house. The children's eyes grew bigger and bigger with excitement. Was not Jimmy Edwards going to be arrested for murder? The horrid whisper ran. One small boy, beginning to whimper, asked if Jimmy was going to be hung. The occasion was solemn even to the older eyes of Mr. Peaslee. "Supposin' it was me," he said to himself. Presently Mr. Edwards, Jim, and the constable emerged from the house. Jim looked white and frightened, but was bravely trying to bear himself like a man. Mr. Edwards, his long-shaven upper lip stiff as a board, looked stern and uncompromising. Barton was as big and good-humored as ever. He turned upon the little boys and girls, and waving his arm, cried, "Scat!" They fell back about 10 feet. Thus the procession formed, Barton and Jim, then Mr. Edwards, and, at a barely respectful distance, the crowd of youngsters. Mr. Peaslee, much moved, but trying hard not to show it, thrust his rake under the veranda with a great show of care, and joined Mr. Edwards, much to that gentleman's surprise. Solomon's heart was throbbing with a great resolution. "I always aimed to be neighborly," said he, nervously lowering his voice, for he was conscious of his wife still standing on the veranda. "Thought I'd just step along, too. I calculate maybe you'd like company on his bail bond." And he jerked his thumb toward Jim. It was out. He was committed. And Solomon heaved a great sigh, he knew not whether of relief or dismay. There was not indeed any risk in signing with Edwards, who was good for any bail that the justice was likely to require. But what would Mrs. Peaslee say if she knew? He glanced apprehensively toward the house. His wife had gone in, but, evil omen, there, sitting on a fence-post, was the calico cat. She was placidly washing her face, and as her paw twinkled past the big black spot round her right eye, she appeared at that distance to be greeting him with a derisive wink. Mr. Edwards, though his mouth shut tighter than ever at the mention of bail, was surprised and touched. "Thank you," he said. "It's kind of you to think of it." In the village, Sam ushered them into the musty law office of Squire Tucker, Justice of the Peace. The squire was a large, fat man, clothed in rusty black, with a carelessly knotted string tie pendant beneath a rumpled, turned-down collar. He had a smooth-shaven, fat face, lighted by shrewd and kindly eyes, which gleamed at you now through, now over, his glasses. When the party entered he was writing, and merely looked up under his big eyebrows long enough to wave them all to chairs. Jim sat down, with the constable behind him and his father at his left, and studied the man in whose hands he thought that his fate rested. He watched the squire's pen go from paper to ink to paper, and listened to its scratch, and to the buzz of a big fly against the dirty window-pane. Ashamed to look at anyone, he looked at the lawyer's big ink-well, a great circular affair of mottled brown wood. It had several openings, each one with its own little cork attached with a short string to the side of the stand. He had never seen one like it before. Then someone entered the room. Jim, looking sidewise, recognized Jake Hibbard, and began covertly to study his face. He knew that this flabby-faced, dirty man with the little screwed-up eyes and the big screwed-up mouth, stained brown at the corners with tobacco, was Pete Lamoury's lawyer. Familiar for many years to his contemptuous young eyes, Jake now looked sinister and dangerous. What were these men going to do to him? Amid his fluttering emotions and rushing thoughts, one thing only stood fixed and clear. He would not tell on his father. Some day, when all trouble was past, he would let his father know that he knew all the time. Then he guessed his father would be sorry and ashamed. Now, since his father would not take him into his confidence, he would not pretend he did the shooting. That would be his only revenge. Finally, Squire Tucker, pushing his writing aside, ran his fingers through the great mass of his tumbled gray hair and looked quizzically at Jim over his glasses.
"So this," he said, "is the hardened ruffian of whom our esteemed fellow-citizen, Mr. Lamoury, complains."
And indeed Jim, although stubborn, did not seem very dangerous. The squire looked about the room.
"Is he represented by counsel?" he asked.
"No, I represent him," said Mr. Edwards.
"The charge against him is assault with intent to kill, I believe?"
And he looked with demure inquiry at Jake Hibbard, who nodded with a wrath-clouded face. Tucker was not taking the case seriously.
"Well, young man," said the justice to Jim, "what's your explanation of this?"
"We'll waive examination," said Mr. Edwards briefly. The squire leaned back in his chair.
"I suppose," he said with evident reluctance, "I shall have to hold him for the grand jury. But I guess the safety of the community won't be greatly threatened if I let him out on bail. I should think a couple of hundred would do. I suppose there'll be no difficulty about the bond?"
The tone of the proceedings suited Mr. Peaslee well. In his nervousness and abstraction, he had backed up to the rusty, empty iron stove at the end of the room, and stood there, with spread coat-tails, listening intently. On hearing the amount of bail, he gave a sigh of relief. His incautious offer had brought him no dangerous risk. Mr. Edwards, however, did not answer. Instead, consulting the justice with a look, he turned and beckoned Jim to follow him into the hall.
"James," he said, "this is the last chance I shall give you. If you confess to me, I will see that you have proper bail. If you do not, I shall let the law take its course. You may choose."
Jim was exasperated. If his father wished to be mean, let him be mean. At least he might drop this farce, this irritating pretense. He lost his temper.
"I don't care what you do," he said fiercely. "Send me to jail if you want to. I guess I can stand it."
"Is that all you have to say?"
Jim replied with a rebellious glance.
"Very well," said his father. "Then we will go back." Once in the room, he stepped to the squire's desk and talked with him in low tones. Then the justice turned to Jim again, a new gravity in his jolly face.
"Your father," he said, "refuses to go on your bond. Have you any sureties of your own to offer?" "No, sir," said Jim.
Mr. Peaslee was outraged. What kind of a father was this? He half startled forward to offer to be one of the two sureties which the law required, but no, he dare not. The second surety might prove to be any sort of worthless fellow. But Jim in jail! He had not for a moment dreamed of that. He was very indignant with Mr. Edwards. Meanwhile, Jake Hibbard was studying Mr. Edwards' face with puzzled attention. He had supposed that the lumber dealer, whom he knew to be well-to-do, would have paid anything, signed any bond, to protect his boy from jail. He was disconcerted. He drew his one hand across his mouth nervously. "Well, Mr. Barton," said Squire Tucker, "I don't see but what you'll have to take this young man over to Hotel Calkins." Hotel Calkins was the name which local wit gave to the county jail. The words sent a cold shiver down Mr. Peasley's back. They stung him into generosity. As Barton and his prisoner, followed by Mr. Edwards and Jake, brushed by him on their way to the door, he slipped the knife into Jim's hand. When the boy, trying to keep back the tears, looked up inquiringly, he murmured in agitation, "Don't you care, sonny? Now don't you care?" He was greatly stirred, or he would not have been so incautious as to make his present in person and in public. End of chapter.